Carl Jung never set out to become a prophet. He wanted to be a scientist, a man of reason and observation. But reason has limits, and Jung found the edge. Beyond it lay something so vast, so ancient, it stripped the illusion of control from the human mind. He called it the unconscious. To everyone else, the term sounded harmless, an academic idea, a mental basement for forgotten memories. But Jung meant something terrifyingly literal, a force that thinks, feels, and acts through you. He discovered that the psyche is not one. It's a parliament of invisible voices, an ecosystem of instincts, gods, and ghosts, all pretending to be you. And the moment you realize that, sanity starts to tremble. Freud had warned him not to go there. Freud wanted to keep psychology clean, contained, respectable, about childhood, repression, libido. But Jung saw symbols in dreams that didn't belong to childhood. He saw the same imagery appearing in patients who'd never met, crosses, serpents, suns, labyrinths. It was as if something beneath humanity was trying to speak through them. He called these recurring patterns archetypes, living templates of experience, fragments of a mind older than civilization itself, and that was his heresy. Because if our thoughts come from ancient, impersonal forces, then free will isn't what we think it is. This was the beginning of Jung's most dangerous discovery. The human mind is not human. You think you're the author of your actions. Jung said, no, you are a stage. And upon that stage, something far older performs its drama. When he first began mapping this psychic landscape, his own mind rebelled. His dreams turned violent. He saw floods swallowing cities, rivers of blood, corpses rising. Years later, when World War I erupted, he realized the visions had been prophetic. The collective unconscious, that shared reservoir of humanity's soul, had erupted into the outer world. The war was a nightmare made flesh. That's when Jung understood, the psyche is not trapped in our skulls, it spills into the world. It builds nations, religions, revolutions, and when it's ignored, it punishes us. He wrote, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. It sounds poetic until you realize he meant it literally. The ideologies we fight over, the gods we worship, the obsessions that drive us, they're all psychological infections. When one archetype possesses a culture, everything becomes its expression. The 20th century was the age of such possession. The shadow, the dark half of the human soul, erupted in political form. Jung saw it in fascism, communism, nationalism, collective psychoses masquerading as salvation. He said the world's madness comes from individuals refusing to meet their own shadow, and instead projecting it outward, onto the enemy. Every war begins that way, one man's inner conflict made global, but Jung's contemporaries didn't want to hear that. They wanted psychology to fix neuroses, not diagnose civilization. Jung didn't care. He'd seen too much. He wrote, the greatest danger to mankind comes not from nature, but from our own psyche, the powers of the unconscious. He meant that humanity's extinction won't come from asteroids or climate, but from our refusal to confront the monsters we carry inside. The dangerous part of Jung's insight wasn't just his diagnosis of society. It was that he gave people a map to see through the illusion of personality. He told us that what we call the self, our identity, our opinions, our sense of being a singular I, is a mask. Beneath it lies something vaster, and that something wants to evolve. But evolution is violent. To grow conscious means to dismantle the comforting lies that hold your world together. It means realizing your values, your politics, your loves and hates, are not purely yours. They are the voice of an archetype playing itself out through you. Jung saw this firsthand in his patients. He'd watch polite, rational people slowly unravel as their unconscious began to speak. They'd dream of gods and serpents, feel sudden surges of terror or ecstasy they couldn't explain. They weren't sick. They were being confronted by the self, the totality of their psyche. He warned that most people can't survive that meeting. To see the truth of your own mind is to witness the collapse of the ego's little kingdom. and most egos would rather die than surrender. That's why Jung said individuation, the process of becoming whole, feels like madness. It's not therapy, it's initiation, and every initiation begins with a descent. He compared it to alchemy, turning lead into gold. But the lead is your suffering, your guilt, your hidden drives. The gold is awareness, not moral purity, but integration. To bring the unconscious into consciousness is to risk everything. That's why so few attempt it. Jung once wrote, "The meeting with oneself is the first test of courage on the inner way." He meant that to look inward sincerely is to begin a war between who you think you are, and what you truly are, and that, he realized, is the true danger of psychology. It's not about fixing you. It's about destroying you, or rather, destroying the false self that keeps you small, obedient, and blind. He understood something modern psychology has forgotten. The psyche isn't meant to be comfortable, it's meant to be whole, and wholeness includes everything, your darkness, your cruelty, your contradictions. To deny them is to become possessed by them, to face them is to risk transformation. That's the forbidden discovery, the one polite society keeps buried under medication, entertainment, and ideology. Because if people realized how powerful and unstable their own minds truly are, the entire structure of modern control would collapse. We think knowledge frees us, but Jung showed that real knowledge, self-knowledge, is catastrophic. It burns away falsehoods. It strips away identities, it leaves you naked before the chaos inside, and yet, he said, this is the only path to sanity, because the real madness is the illusion of normality, the belief that you can ignore the unconscious forever. You can't. It will break through dreams, symptoms, addictions, obsessions, violence. The unconscious doesn't whisper politely. It invades, and when it does, the question isn't whether you'll survive it, the question is whether you'll understand what's happening. That was Jung's warning to the modern world. Not that we're getting worse, but that we're forgetting what we are, walking contradictions made of light and shadow, order and chaos, and the more we deny one side, the more violently it will return. The forbidden discovery is not just that darkness lives in us, but that it seeks union, it wants to be known, it wants consciousness. That is both the danger and the promise, because once you awaken it, there's no going back. Every child begins life as something whole, not pure, whole. A chaotic blend of instincts, feelings, and impulses with no clear border between good and evil. The infant doesn't yet know shame, guilt, or fear of judgment. It simply is, then the world begins its training. Don't cry. Don't shout. Be polite. Be good. And with every command, the psyche divides, a part of you learns to perform, to smile, to please, to fit into the pattern that earns approval, and another part of you, the disobedient, the raw, the impulsive, gets exiled into darkness. Jung called this the birth of the shadow. It's the invisible twin you pretend doesn't exist, the collection of all you've rejected in yourself, not just your vices, but your forgotten virtues too, your strength, your hunger, your creativity, your primal energy. The shadow is both your devil and your buried God. You can't destroy it. You can only deny it, and in that denial, it grows teeth. The more you repress, the thicker the mask becomes, and behind that mask, the unconscious begins its rebellion. People think evil comes from wicked men. Jung said it comes from repression. The most dangerous person isn't the criminal who knows he's cruel, it's the respectable one who believes he's virtuous, because once you convince yourself you're purely good, you've blinded yourself to your own capacity for harm, you become possessed by your unseen shadow, and then you act it out unconsciously, through manipulation, projection, or violence wrapped in righteousness. That's how entire societies descend into madness while thinking they're saving the world. Every moral crusade hides a repressed desire for domination, every utopian dream masks a fear of freedom, every pure ideology is a shadow seeking expression. Jung witnessed this in Europe before the rise of totalitarianism. He saw how people clung to collective ideals, blood, nation, race. To avoid the unbearable task of facing their own darkness, when individuals refuse that confrontation, the shadow doesn't vanish, it merges. It becomes collective, and when the collective shadow awakens, it devours cities. But Jung's warning wasn't just political, it was personal, because the same pattern unfolds in every human life. You repress your anger, and it mutates into passive aggression. You repress your envy, and it disguises itself as moral judgment. You repress your lust, and it emerges as obsession or shame. The unconscious doesn't disappear, it reappears, in disguise. Jung saw this in dreams, in art, in illness. He treated patients who suffered hallucinations of dark figures stalking them, and realized those figures were symbolic. They were the unacknowledged parts of the self demanding recognition. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That single sentence may be the most dangerous line in modern psychology, because it implies that what we call destiny, the repeating disasters of our relationships, careers, and choices, is self-inflicted. We are haunted not by gods, but by our own disowned fragments. The shadow isn't evil in itself, it becomes evil when ignored, because then it acts independently, unconsciously, like a parasite feeding on denial. That's why Jung said most people aren't truly alive, they're possessed by fragments of personality, reacting mechanically, repeating patterns inherited from the collective. They call it character. Jung called it incomplete individuation. He compared the shadow to a wild animal, dangerous, but also vital. If you befriend it, it becomes your ally, the source of creativity, intuition, and power. If you reject it, it stalks you from the dark, waiting for the moment you slip. But facing it isn't romantic. It's brutal, because the first thing you meet in the shadow is your own hypocrisy. You see how much of your kindness is manipulation, how your compassion hides cowardice, how your ambition masks insecurity, and how your spirituality can become the most sophisticated defense against true self-knowledge. Jung saw this most clearly in religious people. He respected faith but despised false sanctity. He said that those who strive hardest to be good often harbor the darkest unconscious impulses, because their morality is built on repression, not understanding. That's why he believed evil isn't opposite to good, it's the shadow of good, and the greater the light, the darker the shadow it casts. The saints of history, Jung said, often wrestled with demons more terrifying than any sinner. Their holiness was forged through confrontation, not denial. You can't transcend what you refuse to acknowledge. He warned that when the shadow breaks through repression, it doesn't ask permission, it comes as obsession, compulsion, rage, addiction, or breakdown. That's the psyche trying to rebalance itself. But the modern world doesn't understand that language. We medicate it, distract it, pathologize it. We call it mental illness, not realizing it's a symbolic eruption, the soul demanding dialogue. The shadow speaks through symptoms. The symptom is the symbol made flesh, and every ignored emotion is a future symptom in disguise. Jung didn't just theorize this, he lived it. During his own confrontation with the unconscious, he was haunted by visions. A woman with serpent eyes appeared in his dreams. A wise old man named Philemon began teaching him in his imagination. He treated them as real, because, to the psyche, they are aspects of the self made visible. He recorded these visions in the Red Book, a secret text he kept hidden for decades because he knew the world wasn't ready. It wasn't ready to hear that the mind contains beings of its own creation, that the shadow isn't metaphorical, it's alive. The line between sanity and possession, Jung discovered, is thinner than anyone dares to admit. Most people are partially possessed, by anger, ideology, trauma, religion, or desire. Total possession happens when the ego collapses completely and an archetype takes over. That's when a person becomes the mouthpiece of something ancient, a god or a monster. History is full of such moments. Every dictator who believed he was destiny incarnate, every prophet who mistook his own psyche for divine revelation, all were victims of the same disease, identification with the archetype. That's why Jung insisted on humility in the face of the unconscious. The moment you think you control it, you've already fallen under its spell. He told his students, beware of unearned wisdom. He meant that contact with the unconscious can inflate the ego, filling it with delusions of grandeur. You see a symbol, and suddenly you believe you're chosen, you feel an archetype's energy, and you mistake it for your own power. That is the most dangerous psychological sign of all, inflation. When a person fuses with the archetype, believing they are its embodiment, reality disintegrates. They no longer have thoughts. Thoughts have them. Jung called this psychic inflation the nuclear bomb of the soul. It can destroy individuals, movements, entire civilizations, because when millions are possessed by the same idea of purity, righteousness, or destiny, they cease to be human. They become archetypes in motion, unconscious instruments of history's next catastrophe. That's what Jung meant when he said, the gods have become diseases. They no longer appear in temples, they manifest as isms, obsessions, and manias, and behind each one is the same force, the shadow, unacknowledged, demanding incarnation. To face it is dangerous, to ignore it is fatal. Jung's discovery was that the only path to sanity is through shadow integration, not destruction, not repression, integration, because the shadow contains not only darkness, but also vitality. Buried in it is your authenticity, your creative fire, your untamed life force. The shadow is the gatekeeper to the soul, and those who fear it will never be whole. Carl Jung didn't start as a mystic. He was a doctor, a clinician with ink-stained hands and a mind sharpened by science. He dissected dreams the way others dissected corpses. But somewhere between the patients who heard voices and the nights he spent staring into his own darkness, Jung stumbled upon something so vast it terrified even him. The human mind is not one thing. It's a battlefield. And consciousness, the proud, logical, daylight part of us, is just a fragile island floating on an ocean of chaos. That ocean, Jung realized, is the unconscious. Not merely repressed memories or childish wishes, but a living, breathing system, ancient, intelligent, and infinitely more powerful than the ego that pretends to rule it. The discovery sounds poetic until you meet it in real life. Because when you do, it doesn't whisper, it devours. Jung wrote in his journal that the unconscious is not merely evil by nature. But he also warned, if ignored, it becomes evil. Everything we reject in ourselves, our envy, lust, cruelty, fear, weakness, gathers strength in the shadows, waiting to return. When it does not ask permission. He called it the shadow, the buried twin of the self, the face you refuse to acknowledge in the mirror. Every civilization, every religion, every ideology tries to bury its own shadow, the parts that contradict its ideals. But Jung saw what happens when you bury too much truth. The psyche revolts. The monsters come crawling out, demanding recognition. That was his dangerous discovery, not a metaphor, not mysticism, but a psychological law. The more a person, or a culture, denies its darkness, the more violently it returns. He learned this not from books, but from the breakdowns of his patients, and eventually from his own. During what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung experienced months of visions so intense he feared for his sanity. He wrote, "It seemed to me I was living in an insane asylum of my own making." But he didn't run. He recorded everything, the red serpent, the bloody rivers, the voices that claimed to be gods, and through that horror, he realized the truth modern man can't bear. The path to sanity runs straight through madness. You cannot escape what you repress. You can only face it. Most people never do. They project instead, blaming the world for what they hate in themselves. They condemn others for sins that belong to their own shadow. Jung saw it everywhere, in wars, in politics, in love. A man represses his weakness and worships strength, soon he despises the weak. A woman denies her aggression, she calls the ambitious toxic. Every projection is a mirror turned outward, every accusation is a confession disguised as virtue. Jung wrote that humanity's greatest danger is not nature or technology, but our refusal to know ourselves. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That single sentence is the core of his dangerous discovery. It explains why people repeat the same mistakes. Why civilizations rise and collapse. Why individuals destroy what they love. Because they are not living, they are being lived by forces they do not understand. You think you are choosing. But the truth is, something in you is choosing through you, your fears, your traumas, your forgotten desires. They steer the ship while you believe you're at the wheel. Jung called this possession, not in the religious sense, though he didn't rule that out, but as a psychological event, a complex, an archetype, or a repressed image seizes control of the ego. You see it when someone's emotions explode out of proportion, when rational people act like strangers. When a nation suddenly worships or hates with blind fury, possession is not rare. It is the default state of the modern world, because Jung also discovered something darker. Our entire civilization is structured to protect us from ourselves. Entertainment, distraction, ideology, all serve one purpose, to keep the unconscious buried. Because if it rises, the system collapses. He saw it first in the early 20th century, in the mass psychosis that birthed totalitarian regimes. The collective shadow of millions projected onto chosen enemies. The civilized mind possessed by ancient archetypes, the hero, the enemy, the savior, the devil, people no longer thought, they were moved by myth. Jung realized myths were not stories humans invented. They were psychic blueprints emerging from the collective unconscious, the shared inner world of humanity. Every god, every demon, every angel ever imagined, these are symbols of inner forces, patterns that live within us all. The danger begins when we forget that, when we mistake inner figures for outer reality. That's when the mind fractures, and the world burns. He wrote, the gods have become diseases. By this, he meant that what ancient people experienced as divine possession, voices, visions, visitations, now appear in modern men and women as neurosis, mania, or depression. The gods didn't die, they moved inside us, and now they want recognition. This was the forbidden knowledge Jung stumbled into, that the psyche is not personal property, but a shared, living field. When one person loses contact with it, we call it insanity. When millions do, we call it progress. The signs of collapse are subtle at first, the loss of meaning, the rise of cynicism disguised as intelligence, the worship of pleasure, the hatred of discipline, the glorification of victimhood, all symptoms of a psyche in revolt, the unconscious breaking through the polite mask of civilization. Jung warned that if humanity refused to integrate its shadow, it would manifest externally, as chaos, conflict, and collective madness. He didn't speak as a prophet, but as a doctor diagnosing a dying mind. He saw the psychological signs of collapse not just in individuals but in societies, an obsession with identity, an inability to tolerate ambiguity, the return of myth in politics and media. The hunger for saviors and scapegoats, all of them point to one thing: the unconscious is rising again. And like a flood, it doesn't ask for permission. That's the beginning of Jung's dangerous discovery, and the first sign of its truth. The psyche, ignored too long, always takes its revenge. The only question is whether we face it consciously or live it out as tragedy. In the next part, we'll go deeper, into the anatomy of the shadow itself, how it forms, how it hunts, and how you can tell when it's already begun to move within you. Every human is born whole. Before we learn to speak, to behave, to belong, the psyche is one continuous field. The infant doesn't know the difference between light and dark, good and evil, self and other. It simply is a pure current of life, unbroken by moral judgment. But then comes civilization. We're told what is acceptable and what is forbidden, not only by parents and teachers but by the entire weight of human history pressing down on us. The boy who cries is told to be strong, the girl who shows anger is told to be kind, the dreamer is told to be practical, the rebel is told to obey. Piece by piece, the soul begins to split. The traits that earn approval are brought into the light, the rest, the wild, instinctive, unfiltered impulses, are thrown into the dark. That darkness becomes the shadow. It doesn't vanish. It waits. Every desire you deny, every fear you suppress, every truth you refuse to speak, all of it collects like sediment at the bottom of your being. The shadow remembers everything consciousness rejects. Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." Because to face it means to admit that you are not who you think you are. People imagine the shadow as evil. Jung disagreed. He said it's immoral, a container for the rejected life force of the psyche. It contains both destruction and creativity, hatred and love. The danger isn't that it exists, it's that we refuse to meet it. The ego, proud and fragile, wants to believe it's pure. It builds an identity, a mask Jung called the persona. The persona is what you show the world. It's your social armor, your professional face, your curated image, but behind it, the shadow grows. The more rigid the persona, the darker the shadow becomes. The saint's shadow is the devil, the moral crusader's shadow is corruption, the good man hides unspeakable rage, the humble hides secret pride. This is why Jung said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." What we repress does not disappear, it transforms. It sneaks into dreams, slips out in sarcasm, flashes through the eyes when someone touches a buried nerve. It drives addictions, obsessions, perversions. You think you're in control, but the shadow moves through you like a second consciousness. That's the first dangerous sign, when you start noticing patterns that don't make sense, when you keep choosing the same kind of person who hurts you, when you destroy opportunities right before success, when you say, "I don't know why I did that." That's not random, that's the shadow steering. You can't see it directly, but you can feel its presence. The quickening heartbeat when someone challenges your identity, the envy you pretend not to feel, the disgust that hides desire. Most people respond by doubling down on denial. They call it morality or self-control. But it's fear. Because to look at the shadow is to risk finding out that you are not the hero of your story, you're also the villain. Jung warned that the more a person identifies with goodness, the more dangerous their shadow becomes. The righteous are the easiest to possess because they believe they're incapable of evil. History proves it. The inquisitor burns witches to save souls, the revolutionary kills in the name of justice, the politician lies to protect the people, the therapist manipulates to heal. Each one believes the shadow lives in someone else, but the psyche doesn't work that way. Whatever you refuse to own in yourself will appear in the world as fate, or as the enemy. That's the second dangerous sign. Projection. The unconscious uses projection to reveal what consciousness denies. You hate in others what you refuse to see in yourself. The more emotional your reaction, the closer it hits home. When you meet someone who provokes irrational disgust or admiration, stop. That's the shadow showing its face. It's trying to speak. Jung once said that the meeting with oneself is of all things the most frightening. Because the shadow doesn't just contain evil, it contains potential. It holds the parts of you that never had permission to live. Inside your shadow is the courage you repressed to survive childhood, the sexuality you buried to be accepted, the intelligence you hid to fit in, the imagination you killed to stay sane. The shadow is not your enemy. It's your unlived life, but if you keep it buried, it becomes poison. Jung saw this in patients who seemed morally upright but suffered nightmares, anxiety, and inexplicable rage. The psyche was demanding integration. He compared it to alchemy, the ancient art of transforming lead into gold. The alchemist's furnace was not about metal but about the human soul. The lead of the shadow must be heated by consciousness until it transforms into wisdom. But few endure the fire, most flee from it, into distraction, ideology, or blame. That leads to the third dangerous sign, the fragmentation of the personality. when the ego refuses integration, the psyche compensates, different selves begin to take over, the calm professional, the impulsive lover, the cruel inner critic. You shift between them without noticing. The ancient world called them spirits. Jung called them autonomous complexes, clusters of emotion and memory that behave like subpersonalities. When a complex takes control, you are possessed. It speaks through your mouth, acts through your hands, ruins your relationships, and then vanishes, leaving you wondering who you are. The frightening part is that these fragments are alive. They carry intelligence. They know what you fear, what you desire, what you hide. And they will do anything to complete themselves. This is the true origin of inner demons, not myth, mechanism. The psyche, deprived of unity, creates monsters to get your attention. Jung didn't believe in exorcising them. He believed in dialogue. You must speak with your shadow, negotiate with your inner devils, and make peace with what you've disowned. This isn't metaphorical therapy talk. It's survival. Because what you refuse to integrate, life will externalize. You repress aggression, the world brings you bullies. You repress desire, you attract temptation. You repress fear, you find yourself surrounded by threats. The unconscious will keep sending mirrors until you look, and that's how the shadow grows from private pain into public catastrophe. When millions of people refuse to face their darkness, it fuses into a collective force. The crowd becomes its body, the ideology becomes its mask, the war becomes its ritual. Jung saw this happen in his lifetime, the collective shadow of Europe erupting into fascism and genocide. He knew it wasn't politics, it was possession on a mass scale. When the individual refuses the burden of self-knowledge, the shadow takes the world as its stage. That's why Jung's discovery was so dangerous. It stripped away the illusion of innocence. Evil is not out there. It is within. And until you face it, you are its instrument. He wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That sentence is the axis of the entire human condition. The shadow is not your punishment, it is your teacher. But it teaches through crisis. And that brings us to the next descent, the stage Jung feared most, when the shadow takes control, and the mind begins to fracture, because there's a difference between having a shadow and being taken by it. That's the threshold between psychology and possession. The shadow doesn't announce itself politely, it creeps. It waits. Then one day, it takes the wheel. Jung said the unconscious is like a wild animal chained in the basement. You can ignore the sounds for years, until the chain snaps. And when it does, it doesn't want conversation. It wants compensation. The first sign of possession is subtle, a distortion of emotion. Something ordinary triggers a reaction far beyond proportion. You hear a criticism and explode, a stranger's success fills you with inexplicable rage, a small setback feels like apocalypse. The conscious mind always rationalizes afterward, I was tired, I had a bad day, they provoked me. But Jung warned that when emotion exceeds the situation, you are no longer in control. A complex has taken command. These autonomous fragments have their own energy, their own motives. They lie dormant until an event, or a person, activates them. You think you're arguing with your boss, but you're really fighting your father. You think you're jealous of your friend, but you're confronting your own self-contempt. The present moment becomes haunted by the past you refuse to face. That's the first psychological sign of danger, time distortion. When the past hijacks the present, you are living in a psychic loop. Jung saw this in patients who couldn't escape repetitive patterns. The faces changed, the cities changed, the jobs changed, but the story stayed the same. Because the psyche doesn't care about circumstances, it cares about integration. Until the lesson is learned, the teacher returns. The second sign is symbolic invasion. Dreams, synchronicities, coincidences start to feel charged, alive with intention. You think of someone, and they call. You see patterns everywhere. Jung didn't dismiss this as madness. He called it psychic compensation. when consciousness becomes too one-sided, too rational, too moral, too controlled, the unconscious compensates by flooding reality with symbols. It's trying to restore balance, it wants to speak. If you ignore it, the symbols intensify, dreams become nightmares, coincidences become confrontations. The psyche begins to act through the external world to deliver the message you refuse to hear. Most people panic at this stage. They call it bad luck, divine punishment, or conspiracy. But Jung insisted, the gods have returned as symptoms. When the unconscious can't reach you through dreams, it reaches through events. That's why he told his patients to record their dreams and treat them as messages from the deeper self. Not predictions, communications. The third dangerous sign is emotional possession. You feel an emotion not as something you have, but as something that has you. Rage consumes. Grief devours. Desire blinds. You say, I couldn't help myself. That's not metaphor, that's diagnosis. The ego is no longer steering. A complex has taken command. It uses your energy like fuel, acting out its script until it's exhausted. When it's over, you feel drained, ashamed, alien to yourself. That's because you were temporarily displaced. Jung wrote that the goal of analysis is not to suppress emotion, but to understand its source, to ask, who in me feels this? Because within every possession, there's an image, a forgotten child, a betrayed lover, a humiliated parent. The complex wears masks, but its core is pain. The fourth sign is moral inversion. You begin justifying what you once knew was wrong, you betray values you once held sacred, you rationalize cruelty in the name of justice, you call obsession love. You call control care. Jung said the shadow often disguises itself as virtue. It doesn't tempt with obvious evil, it tempts with moral certainty. The most dangerous people are not the openly corrupt, they're the ones convinced of their righteousness. When you notice yourself defending something with intensity but no compassion, stop. The shadow loves conviction. It hides behind causes, it speaks in the voice of truth, but it carries the vibration of hate. That's the fifth sign, the loss of empathy. As the shadow takes control, others become objects, tools, enemies, mirrors. You stop seeing people, you start seeing projections. Love becomes control. Friendship becomes manipulation. You no longer relate, you manage. Jung observed that patients who lost empathy also lost their sense of reality. Because empathy is what anchors you in the human world. Without it, you drift into abstraction, ideology, paranoia, fanaticism. That's how collective madness begins. He wrote, fanaticism is always a compensation for doubt. The more someone insists they're absolutely right, the more you can be sure the unconscious is trying to balance their arrogance. The sixth sign is existential fatigue. You feel like a stranger in your own life. Work, love, ambition, all lose color. You move through days like an actor reading lines. This isn't depression in a clinical sense, it's the soul withdrawing energy from a false identity. The psyche refuses to invest in lies forever. When you betray your inner truth long enough, it shuts down cooperation. You lose motivation because the real you has gone underground. This is the stage most people medicate away. They drown it in entertainment, work, or substances. But Jung saw it as the beginning of transformation. He called it the nigredo, the blackening, the first phase of alchemy. The soul dissolves the false self so the real one can emerge, but before rebirth comes death, and the seventh sign is exactly that, the death of meaning. Everything you believed collapses, your values disintegrate, your God dies, you are left staring into the void. Jung knew this darkness personally. During his own confrontation with the unconscious, he felt abandoned by reason and faith. He wrote, I had to let myself fall into the depths. It was a descent into the dark world of Hades. He called it psychological death. The moment the old identity cannot survive the expansion of consciousness, it's the most dangerous sign because it's the threshold of madness and transformation. Most turn back, some don't make it, but those who endure discover something extraordinary. Beneath the ruins of the ego lies the self, not the social self, but the archetypal center of the psyche. The self is the totality that includes both light and dark, human and divine. It's what Jung called the God within. But reaching it means passing through the underworld of your own mind, he wrote. No one can know what the psyche is unless he experiences it in himself. That's why Jung's discovery was called dangerous. Not because it was wrong, because it was true. He didn't theorize about the shadow, he lived it. He saw that the mind is not a closed system of thoughts but a living cosmos. And every individual is a miniature world whose balance can collapse or renew the entire species. When the unconscious erupts, it feels like madness, but it's actually an initiation. The question is whether you can survive it consciously. Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. He meant it literally. The psyche doesn't evolve through comfort. It evolves through crisis, so if you find yourself in these dangerous signs, distorted emotions, compulsive repetition, moral inversion, loss of empathy, collapse of meaning, understand this, you are not broken. You are being called, the unconscious is trying to awaken you, but if you resist, it will destroy you to save you. That's the paradox Jung uncovered, that healing and destruction are the same force seen from different sides of the mirror. And now that the shadow has risen, the next stage is inevitable. It moves beyond the personal. It infects the collective. The madness spreads through culture, politics, religion, until an entire civilization begins to behave like a fractured mind. That's where we go next, into the world Jung feared most, the age when society itself becomes the patient. Jung once wrote that the world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human psyche. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. Civilization isn't a structure of steel and law, it's a psychological contract. The moment the mind of man fractures, the world he builds fractures with it, and that's exactly what Jung began to see, not just individuals in neurosis, but societies losing contact with the unconscious, entire nations behaving like psychotic patients. He saw it first in the early 20th century, when Europe descended into 2 world wars. The same pattern he recognized in his patients, repression, projection, possession, played out on a global scale. The collective shadow had awakened. For centuries, the Western world told itself a flattering story, that man was rational, moral, and civilized. Science replaced God, progress replaced myth. We became the enlightened. But what happens when enlightenment denies the darkness that made it possible? The shadow returns, not as myth, but as machinery, industrialization, mechanized war, propaganda, ideologies that promised salvation but delivered slaughter. The unconscious had erupted through the very tools of reason. Jung warned, the greater the light, the darker the shadow. The more we glorify progress, the more violently we repress what progress costs: meaning, soul, connection, humility. The modern world built towers of reason while burying the irrational. But what you bury doesn't die, it mutates. Now our myths wear new faces: corporations, governments, influencers, algorithms. The pantheon of the 21st century glows on screens instead of temples. The collective unconscious never vanished, it just changed its wardrobe. Jung predicted this. He said modern man would suffer not from sin, but from meaninglessness. He called it the neurosis of modernity. People would have everything: comfort, technology, pleasure, yet feel hollow. Because material progress cannot compensate for spiritual amnesia. That's the first sign of a sick society, the loss of symbolic life. We mistake consumption for fulfillment. We scroll endlessly, not seeking knowledge, but anesthesia. We worship images, not ideals. We feel connected, but never seen. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Our entire digital age is proof. Social media is not communication, it's projection at scale. Each post a fragment of persona, each argument a battle between shadows. You're not fighting strangers online, you're wrestling with your own disowned parts reflected in others. The collective unconscious has migrated into the internet. It's not a metaphor, it's a manifestation. Memes, trends, viral outrage, these are modern archetypes, ancient psychic patterns reborn in code, and just like in the mind of a patient. The stronger the repression, the more chaotic the eruption. The second sign of a collapsing psyche is polarization. When a society splits into extremes, you're not seeing politics, you're seeing the fragmentation of the collective ego. One side identifies with the persona, rational, moral, civilized. The other becomes the shadow, primal, emotional, chaotic. Both need each other to exist. Both project evil onto the other. Jung said the surest way to become possessed is to believe that evil is entirely outside yourself. That's what nations do when they dehumanize enemies. That's what ideologues do when they hunt heretics. That's what social movements do when they demand purity over truth. Every crusade creates its own devil, every utopia births a gulag, because the shadow must live somewhere, and if we refuse to carry it consciously, it manifests collectively as violence. That's the third sign, mass possession. When the individual self dissolves into the crowd, responsibility disappears. People chant, riot, destroy, obey, not as themselves, but as extensions of a larger psychic force. Jung said the crowd is the most dangerous entity on earth because it has no soul, only emotion. He called this state participation mystique, where individuals merge into a collective mind. Losing autonomy, the same mechanism that creates spiritual communion in religion creates hysteria in politics, and our era has rediscovered both extremes, the cult and the mob, two faces of the same archetype, the longing to belong, to dissolve into something larger than the unbearable loneliness of the isolated ego. That loneliness is the fourth sign, spiritual starvation. Our ancestors lived within myth. Every ritual, every festival, every prayer gave meaning to suffering. We live within data. We have information but no wisdom. We've replaced initiation with entertainment, and wonder with irony, but the psyche doesn't forget its hunger, so it invents substitutes, fandoms, conspiracy theories, political tribes. These are not random hobbies, they're desperate attempts to recreate myth in a world that denies it. The religious instinct hasn't vanished, it's gone underground, and when religion is repressed, it returns in distorted form, as obsession, as ideology, as addiction. That's why Jung said, we do not possess the truth possesses us. When people say they've found their cause, listen closely, it's not always they who found it, but the archetype that found them. And the fifth sign of collective pathology is the worship of power. When meaning collapses, people don't stop believing, they start believing in force. If you can't find God in yourself, you look for gods who promise control. That's how tyrants rise. That's how corporations become idols. That's how technology becomes religion. The screen has replaced the altar, the algorithm replaced the priest, and we kneel daily, offering our attention, the most sacred currency of the psyche. Jung warned that when man loses his inner authority, he becomes a slave to outer systems. He wrote, the less you are aware of your own shadow, the more it appears in others, and the more you are controlled by it. That's the tragedy of the modern age. We believe we are free because we choose between illusions. The unconscious has become industrialized. Our fears, desires, and dreams are harvested for profit. We have digitized the archetypes. The lover is a dating app, the warrior is a brand, the trickster is an influencer, the sage is an algorithm pretending to be wise. We are living inside Jung's Red Book, but no one realizes it. He said that the gods have become diseases. In our time, they've become apps, and the collective mind is showing symptoms, anxiety epidemics, identity crises, ideological extremism, and the quiet terror that beneath all our progress, we are spiritually regressing. The sixth sign of collapse is nihilism disguised as freedom. We say everything is relative as if it's liberation, but it's despair. Without shared values, society dissolves into competing egos. Without inner truth, Outer order rots. Jung warned that the fall of a civilization begins when its symbols lose meaning, when truth becomes ironic, when morality becomes fashion, when the sacred becomes entertainment. That's where we stand now, between spectacle and collapse. The collective shadow has taken the stage, dressed in glamour and noise. And most don't even recognize it, because they're entertained by their own possession. Jung said that the fate of humanity depends on a single question: whether we can make the unconscious conscious. If we don't, the psyche will continue to act itself out, through crises, wars, revolutions, until it's heard. The final dangerous sign, then, is apocalyptic imagination, when a society dreams of its own end, through films, art, memes, or politics. It's revealing its buried wish for renewal. Destruction becomes fantasy because the unconscious longs for rebirth. Jung said the apocalypse is not the end of the world, it's the end of the ego's world. What collapses is not the planet, it's the illusion of control. The cure isn't revolution. It's individuation, because only individuals can confront the shadow. The crowd never will. That's why Jung placed all hope in the individual who dares to become conscious, not to preach, not to save, but to integrate, because a single integrated soul radiates more sanity than 1,000 possessed minds. The collective can't be healed directly. It's healed one person at a time, each facing their own darkness, refusing to project it outward, and that brings us to the final descent, the confrontation and the cure, the stage Jung called the path of individuation, where the seeker meets the unconscious and learns to walk with it, not against it. Because the only thing more dangerous than knowing the shadow is pretending you don't have one. Carl Jung never promised salvation, only wholeness, but wholeness, in Jung's world, is not comfort. It's confrontation. To become whole, one must descend. He called this path individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche into a single, authentic self. It sounds noble until you realize what it demands: the dismantling of everything you think you are. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And he meant it. The unconscious doesn't come bearing gifts. It comes dragging corpses, the parts of you you've buried, denied, or feared. When Jung underwent his own descent, he didn't find enlightenment, he found chaos. During his so-called confrontation with the unconscious, he hallucinated, spoke to archetypal figures, recorded visions of gods and demons, and wrote what became the Red Book. He said it nearly drove him insane. That was the cost of consciousness. To bring light into darkness, you must enter the darkness first, he called it. Active imagination, a dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. In practice, it feels like madness. The rational mind loses control. Images, symbols, and emotions flood in. You begin to realize that you, the voice narrating your life, is not the only inhabitant in your own head. This is the first gate of individuation, the recognition of multiplicity. The psyche is not a singular entity, it's a parliament of forces, some ancient, some divine, some monstrous. The ego is just the chairperson pretending to be king. Once you realize this, the illusion of control shatters, and that's when the real descent begins. Jung described the unconscious as both creative and destructive, a realm of opposites. It contains not only your repressed traumas but also your potential. It's the same place where nightmares are born and art is inspired. To face it, you must learn to see without judgment, to feel without being consumed. But most people can't. They encounter the shadow and either worship it or deny it. One leads to possession, the other to repression, both forms of unconscious slavery. The descent requires a third way, integration. You don't kill the shadow. You converse with it, you recognize it as part of yourself, your capacity for rage, lust, envy, cruelty, and you stop pretending you're pure, because purity is a lie that breeds monsters. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." It's not the halo that saves you, it's the willingness to see your horns. He saw the shadow not as evil, but as energy. Everything we repress, aggression, ambition, sexuality, pride, contains life force. When denied, it poisons us; when integrated, it empowers us. That's the paradox. The shadow hides the treasure. Every myth reflects this truth. The hero must descend into the underworld to reclaim what was lost. Orpheus, Dante, Christ. Jung recognized them all as archetypes of individuation, psychological blueprints of transformation, but he warned that the descent is not symbolic poetry. It's a lived ordeal. When you enter your own depths, you meet archetypes not as metaphors, but as presences: the anima, the wise old man, the trickster, the child, the shadow itself. Each one reflects a dimension of your psyche that must be faced and balanced. The anima, the inner feminine, is the gatekeeper. She represents feeling, intuition, the bridge to the unconscious. Men who repress her become emotionally sterile, obsessed with control. Women who deny their inner masculine, the animus, lose direction and purpose. Individuation demands that both energies be reconciled, not divided. In Jung's own visions, the anima appeared as Salome, a dark seductress. She guided him, challenged him, seduced him, frightened him, until he learned she was not an external demon, but his soul. That's what individuation feels like. Your demons slowly revealing themselves as misunderstood gods, but the ego resists. It clings to identity. It says, I am this. I am not that. And the unconscious replies, you are both. The second gate is the death of the persona. The mask must crack. You begin to see how much of your personality is performance, shaped by approval, fear, and imitation. You realize that your virtues may just be social strategies. Your humility may hide pride. Your kindness may hide control. This realization burns. It's the psychological crucifixion, the moment the ego realizes it is not the whole story. If the shadow was the dragon, the persona is the golden cage. To become whole, both must die. That's why individuation feels like betrayal, of your family, your culture, your religion, even your past self, because you're no longer living by borrowed values. You're forging your own, and society despises that kind of freedom. Jung said that individuation is a crime in the eyes of the collective, because it threatens conformity. The individuated person becomes unpredictable, no longer easily controlled by ideology or guilt. That's why prophets are crucified and thinkers exiled. They refuse to play by the rules of unconscious tribes. The third gate is the encounter with the self. Jung described the self as both the totality of the psyche and the divine center within it, the organizing principle that transcends ego. It's the inner God image, not created by man but revealed through him. When you've faced your shadow and surrendered your persona, the self emerges, not as an idea, but as an experience, a moment of terrifying clarity where you realize you are not the master of your mind, but its expression. It's the moment mystics describe as union with the divine, what Jung called the numinous experience. It humbles the ego completely. You see that consciousness is not yours, it's something you participate in. You are not thinking, you are being thought. You are not dreaming, you are being dreamed. This realization is both liberation and annihilation. Liberation, because you're no longer trapped in identity. Annihilation, because identity was your anchor. That's why many stop midway. They taste the abyss and retreat into normalcy. They prefer a comfortable lie to the unbearable truth, that the psyche is older and vaster than the self. But those who continue, who survive the disintegration, emerge transformed, not enlightened, but integrated. They carry their shadow without shame. They act consciously, not reactively. They become what Jung called individuated beings, not saints, but whole humans. And the world reacts to such people as it always has, with suspicion, because wholeness in one person exposes fragmentation in others. The individuated person is dangerous, not because they wish harm, but because they see through illusions. They can't be manipulated by collective fear or seduced by ideology. They embody what Jung called the moral autonomy of the individual, which he saw as the only antidote to mass madness. He believed that only those who face their own unconscious can prevent its collective eruption. That's why he said, the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. Individuation, then, is not selfish. It's the highest form of responsibility, because the unconscious, if ignored, becomes fate, but if confronted, it becomes destiny, and yet Jung never romanticized the process. He called it a descent into hell. He said that to integrate the unconscious is to risk dissolution. Many who begin do not return. It's not therapy. It's initiation. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening. The stage where everything dissolves into chaos before new form arises. They didn't mean literal metal, they meant the soul. Jung saw in their symbols a mirror of the psyche's transformation. He said the philosopher's stone was a symbol of the self, the eternal spark that endures after the ego burns away. Individuation, then, is psychological alchemy, base instincts transmuted into wisdom, shadow into power, suffering into consciousness. The descent doesn't end in light, it ends in integration. Because consciousness is not about escaping darkness, but learning to carry it without becoming it. That's the paradox Jung left us with. To find yourself, you must lose yourself. To become whole, you must be broken. To awaken, you must first dream. And the dream of modern man, progress without soul, freedom without meaning, is collapsing, which means the descent is no longer optional, it's collective. The unconscious is calling all of us. Some will go willingly, most will be dragged, and that leads us to Jung's final and most dangerous insight, the truth that every religion, philosophy, and psychology fears to admit: the self is not only light. It is both creator and destroyer. To know it is to face God, and realize that God lives in the depths of your own mind. Carl Jung's greatest discovery was also his most dangerous. The psyche is real, not metaphorically, not symbolically, real, autonomous, self-organizing, and older than consciousness itself. He realized that the mind is not inside you, you are inside it, and once you grasp that, the illusion of separateness dissolves. He wrote, "The gods have become diseases." But what he meant was this: what ancient man saw as divine visitations, possession, inspiration, revelation, modern man experiences as neurosis, mania, obsession. We no longer speak with the gods, so they speak through our symptoms. Jung's clinical rooms were cathedrals of the unconscious. His patients didn't just suffer personal trauma, they enacted myths. He saw businessmen haunted by dreams of floods and serpents, artists tormented by the same archetypes that once filled temples, housewives dreaming of gods they'd never read about. He realized the psyche doesn't invent symbols, it remembers them. Every dream, every neurosis, every hallucination was a message from the same collective source, the unconscious mind of humanity. But the more he studied it, the more he feared it. Because he understood that the unconscious is not beneath us, it's below us only in metaphor. In truth, it is the foundation upon which everything human stands, and when that foundation shakes, civilizations fall. That's why Jung called his work a dangerous experiment. To explore the unconscious is to risk contamination by it. He warned his students, do not call up the shadow unless you are prepared to serve it. Because once you awaken the deeper layers of psyche, they do not go back to sleep, they begin to live through you, changing your relationships, your thoughts, your sense of time and death. The unconscious doesn't adapt to the ego. The ego must adapt to it. That's why Jung spent the rest of his life balancing on the edge between genius and madness. He had stared too long into the abyss, and the abyss, polite as always, stared back. He wrote of his visions in language that terrified the scientific world. He spoke of gods within the psyche, of the soul as an objective reality, of psychic energies that behave like living beings. To his colleagues, it sounded mystical, heretical even. But Jung wasn't preaching religion. He was describing observation. He said, the psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders, and the only one we can directly observe. That was his real heresy, treating the inner world with the same seriousness as the outer. Because modern science studies stars but not symbols. It dissects bodies but ignores souls. Jung broke that taboo. He insisted that psychology is not a branch of medicine, it's a continuation of theology by other means, and for that, the world half worshipped him, half exiled him. He stood between reason and revelation, between the laboratory and the temple. He said the unconscious is both biological and divine, that its symbols are not hallucinations but communications. His most dangerous claim was simple: God is a psychological fact, not a belief, but an experience. Not a being out there, but a presence in here. He didn't mean God was imaginary, he meant imagination itself is the organ through which divinity speaks. That's the truth science still refuses to hear, and religion still fears to face, because if Jung is right, the apocalypse humanity dreads is not cosmic, it's psychological. It's not fire from the sky, it's fire from within. The end of the world will come as an inner event. The collapse of the ego's illusion of control. He saw this in his own visions. He wrote of floods, fires, blood, archetypal images of renewal. He said these weren't prophecies, but warnings. When the collective unconscious is ignored, it breaks through violently to restore balance. That's what he meant by the word enantiodromia, the tendency of all things to turn into their opposite. The light becomes darkness, reason becomes madness, order becomes chaos, civilization becomes savagery, and unless consciousness evolves, history will repeat itself endlessly, because history is not driven by events, it's driven by the psyche's unresolved conflicts. Jung said the modern world lives in a psychic catastrophe precisely because it denies the soul. We've externalized everything sacred, projected the inner onto the outer until the world itself begins to mirror our madness. That's why technology feels alive, why politics feels mythic, why the internet feels haunted. They are our psyche, made visible. He predicted that humanity would either destroy itself or discover its soul. There is no third option. But here's the paradox that makes Jung's discovery truly dangerous: the same unconscious that births chaos also births consciousness. The same darkness that destroys is the darkness that creates. He saw the devil and God as two faces of one energy, the tension of opposites that sustains life. He refused to choose sides. He said moral growth requires the integration of both, not the denial of either. Because good without evil becomes sterile, and evil without good becomes insane. That's why he wrote, the self is a union of opposites, like Christ and Satan in one body. He wasn't blaspheming, he was describing psychological reality. Light cannot exist without shadow, consciousness cannot exist without unconsciousness. The moment you choose one, you lose balance. And here lies the final truth Jung glimpsed but never fully resolved. The psyche doesn't want peace, it wants wholeness. It doesn't care if you're happy, it wants you to be real. That's why individuation hurts. That's why awakening feels like dying, because the self is not sentimental. It devours illusions to free the soul beneath them. The mystics called this process the dark night. Jung called it the night sea journey. It's the same ancient initiation. The ego must drown so the self can rise, and yet, for all his warnings, Jung saw in this descent not doom, but potential, the birth of a new kind of human. He believed the next stage of evolution would not be biological, but psychological, man becoming conscious of his own unconscious, aware of his divine double. He said, the world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. That's the tragedy of modern man. He lets the world define him. The individuated man defines the world, but such awareness carries a burden. Because once you see the mechanisms of the psyche, once you know that angels and demons are inner realities, you can no longer blame, escape, or worship blindly. You must carry the God within you consciously, and that is Jung's final and most terrifying teaching. To meet God is to take responsibility for him, because what we call God is not just love and light, it is the totality of existence, including the parts we fear. To be conscious is to bear that tension without collapsing into despair or delusion. That is what Jung meant by holding the opposites. It's the essence of psychological maturity. the ability to live between paradoxes without needing resolution, not choosing good over evil, but understanding that both live in you, not seeking perfection, but integration. He once said, "I would rather be whole than good." And that line sums up everything he risked his sanity to teach, because good can be a mask, but wholeness is truth, brutal, beautiful, unrelenting truth. So what, then, is the end of Jung's journey? What was the meaning of his dangerous discovery, that salvation does not lie in escaping the darkness, but in descending into it consciously, that heaven and hell are not places, but psychological states, that every apocalypse is an invitation to transformation? He believed that one day, humanity would realize that the gods we worshipped outside were always reflections of what we refused to see within, that the second coming, the apocalypse, enlightenment, these are metaphors for psychological events, the ego dying, the self-awakening. He wrote near the end of his life, "Man is the mirror that God sees himself in." That's the truth. We are the universe becoming aware of itself. We are myth, matter, and mind intertwined, and the price of that awareness is everything we thought we were. Jung's discovery wasn't a philosophy, it was a warning. To deny the unconscious is to be ruled by it, to face it is to be transformed by it, and to integrate it is to realize that light and darkness were never enemies, they were partners in creation all along. So what do you do with that knowledge? You descend, you confront, you live consciously in a world gone mad with projection, because every act of awareness, every person who faces their own shadow, heals a fragment of the collective. And in that act, the apocalypse becomes revelation, not the end of the world, the beginning of it. That Jung's dangerous discovery, it remains dangerous because it is true.